All right, guys, what we're going to take a look at today is the transformation of Europe from what was once the backwater of the world to eventually, as we're looking at in Unit 5 and Unit 6, the rise of this continent as the foremost and premier power in the world. So the question you're going to review at the end, and something to keep in mind as you take notes and as you go through the lecture, is to evaluate the changes and the continuities in European politics from 1450 to 1750, and there'll be an assignment to go along with this. Now it's a good time if you're looking at the images that are provided here, just as a clue. Hey, at around 1450, at the latter part of the Middle Ages, what term defined European society at this time? So again, if you don't know the answer outright, look at the pictures, look at the clues, and I would suggest pausing the video or reviewing your notes if you're unsure. So do that at this time if you don't know the response. Hopefully what you got is the term feudalism, where European society is really divided up into three different classes, or the French term for it is the estates. The oratores, okay, those who spoke, particularly to God, so the clergy who prayed and attended the spiritual matters. The bellatores, okay, those who fought, particularly the noblemen and the knights of the feudal era. And then there is everybody else, the labores. Now, don't get confused here, okay? And we'll get to this with the French Revolution. This group right here, the labores, okay, isn't just simply the poor. Okay? These are the ones without noble title. Okay? So keep that in mind, especially when we get to the Revolution. This is not a small class. This is not necessarily a poor class by any means here. Okay? But what it is the class that is without special title, okay? Like, for instance, the priests, okay, or the noblemen who have really ruled Europe for the better part of the last century. So our key concepts for today is to look at some of the key transformations and particularly the political outcome, the development of nation states, and we'll look at some of these particular case studies, which in the end will lead to what we call the Enlightenment. Okay, so without further ado, let's take transformations from 1450 to 1750. Okay. So the first of which is you have the breakdown of feudalism right around the 1450s. And if you remember carefully as to what that was, it was on one hand, as this image shows, it was the Black Death that would help to bring that about. Okay? And the Black Death and other issues brought about a number of key peasant rebellions, and not only that, but many serfs for the first time purchasing their freedoms and being allowed to move, purchase land, go to other places, particularly the cities and the towns. Okay? Not only that, but new technologies come into play, and particularly the use of firearms. Okay? Not that these guns were really that good, but hey, you didn't need as much training. If you're a knight, if you're a bowman throughout the medieval period, it took almost a lifetime of training and resources to be able to develop those type of skills. With guns, take a little bit of practice, be able to mass infantry together, and all of a sudden now, okay, you're able to eliminate knights and others with someone who is much less trained than in the past. Not only that, but there were those who were what we call mercenaries, those who fought for a living, who are now available for hire as well, that were utilized by many monarchs and many kings as well. Okay. Furthermore, another key event during this particular time is, especially in the Western Church, if you know the answer to this, and particularly in this particular acronym, go ahead and say it to yourself here. Okay. But the Protestant Reformation and the breakup of the Western Church is going to have a dramatic impact in that you have noblemen, feudal realms, and others really having to make a key decision as to, do I follow the new faith in Protestantism or to continue on with the old one regarding Catholicism? And that leads to and is really one component of what becomes known as the devastating 30 Years' War, which many people credit as one of the worst wars in European history if you actually break down the numbers and the cost in terms of the percentage of the population that would suffer as a result of this as well. So In both of these cases, it's going to result in the limitation of the power of feudal realms and lords and nobles. To add to this here, there is much more revenue that is brought in by these new budding kingdoms from the global colonies that we looked at in the previous unit in both the Americas and Africa as well. Furthermore, we have a number of advances, particularly artistically, socially, through the Renaissance, and particularly a new ways of looking at the physical world through the scientific revolution, a new sense of logic that is being developed at this time as well, whereby the world and the physical world is addressed by reason as opposed to just simply by theology or the Bible or priestly decisions and so forth here. And that leads to eventually a questioning not just of the natural world, but then also the social order as well. So we have a number of changes. You want to be able to sum this up here. We see a decline of the past. Again, not that it goes away, okay, but this notion of hundreds of different noble realms controlling the dozens and dozens of parts of Western Europe, this decentralized governance that has dominated European politics for over 1,000 years, it's on the decline. Challenges made to the Catholic Church will also lead to a discrepancy, a disruption, excuse me, of the power of the Catholic Church as it's being challenged by new Protestant churches and also states that will support these churches as well. And that's going to lead to a rise of new centralized governments, and not as big as we're seeing in the Ottoman Empire or in China and other places here, but brand new forms of governance called nation states, which we're going to look at in just a moment, and the empowerment of that third estate, the laborists, the commoners, many of which, again, aren't poor peasant farmers, although that is the bulk of the population, but it's this new budding middle class that are going to value things like individual liberties as well. So again, not that all of this here goes away. There's a decline in this, but it doesn't go away by any means here. But what we do see is the rise of these new elements. Is a dramatic change in Europe. Here's a map of Europe right around 1400, whereby again you have these hundreds of principalities, small different states. The rise of some of these new ones here, England, France, and the eventual development of Spain and others. But throughout most of Europe, it's feudalism, these ever-shifting boundaries of noble contracts going back and forth, back and forth. That all starts to shift and change by 1900, where all of a sudden now you have these large, powerful states that not only will dominate Europe, but will dominate the globe. So what replaces the feudal order is what we call the nation state. After the end of the 30 Years' War, what developed out of the peace accord there was known as the Peace of Westphalia, in many ways laid the foundation for a system of independent competing nation states. Almost all the European states participated in the drafting of the Peace of Westphalia, and in doing so, they regarded each other as sovereign and equal, that they would mutually recognize each other's rights to organize their own domestic affairs, which includes religious affairs and also includes contracts and other things dealing with different feudal lords as well. And so now you have this new centralized authority that is being recognized across borders as well. Furthermore, many of these kingdoms will be ruled by these new kings that have now gathered new income. If you're wondering what that Spanish silver coming into Europe does, is that in a lot of ways it funds the wars of Europe, but then it also will fund the growing power of these new kings. There's a new centralized taxation order as they start to hire their own bureaucrats. Again, that's coming in. They're now able to hire more men for their own wishes. And as the Catholic Church is being challenged by Protestantism, states and kings are going to go to the church and say, hey, we can help you. We can help you deal with your enemies or those who are challenging your authority. And a really good example of this is the various inquisitions that are created. The most famous which being the Spanish, whereby the Spanish king, Spanish monarch goes to the Pope and say, hey, we would like to show you our devotion to the church, and we would like you to support us in what we do. And in doing so, we're going to create this sort of government authority that'll weed out those who are considered, quote unquote, unbelievers. So if in Spain, for example, you're a Protestant, a Muslim, or a Jew, the new Spanish government is going to say, hey, we're going to either force you to convert, or we kill you, or you're forced to leave. And that leads to another diaspora for groups like the Jews, many of which are going to go and end up in places like the Netherlands, England, and even the Ottoman Empire as well. And so it's not as if the Catholic Church goes away, but again, it's always this independent order now that feels as if it has to engage with the states to retain its authority over Europe. And like we mentioned before, much of this income is going to funding the government, and the result are these new bureaucracies that are formed as well. Okay? Key advisors, specialists, okay, who understand things like the economy, military, and others that will start to influence and affect the decisions that are made by states. And we have two samples of what that might look like. One whereby it's less common at this era, but much more common today, and one that will really dominate politics in Europe for the better part of the next few centuries. And those two are, one, constitutional government, and two, which we'll spend most of our time with, absolutism, because that is more common at this. So let's go and begin with constitutional government. Okay? Now, I don't have time to go through the enormous span of English government, but what's listed right there, in a lot of ways, as power of monarchs are growing in Europe throughout this. Again, it takes a long time for this to happen, as in trying to break apart the power of feudal lords and others. In England, there are particular limitations that they've created on their monarchs that sort of evolve over time. The most famous of which, probably the one that you know, is Magna Carta, or what is known as the Great Charter, which limited the power of the monarch and gave that to the nobles. Eventually, the nobles will come together to want to talk, to parley with one another. And that results in what is the creation of the model parliament in England, whereby the nobles and eventually the commoners will come together to discuss policy, particularly in regards to taxation. That becomes an enormously sensitive issue for the English. This will eventually come to blows in the English Civil War when Parliament finally rejects the policy of the king. They end up fighting. Parliament wins out, and for a short amount of time, they execute their king, and they operate for the first time as a republic. It doesn't last long, and what the English will do is they're going to bring back the monarchy. But what they establish is that monarch, which is actually a foreigner at this point, will be limited in power, limited by really two separate other authorities, one of which is Parliament, which you would imagine, but more particularly that the power of the monarch and the Parliament will be limited by law. In other words, a constitution, thus the creation of what is known as a constitutional monarchy. Okay? Albeit the history of the Dutch Republic just across the English Channel from England is quite different, in that the Dutch were a number of different cities and provinces that were under the rule of the Spanish at this time. Many of these provinces are going to rebel against Spain, and they're going to give authorities to these representative officials known as the stadtholders. So in other words, what the stadtholders will do is they will go ahead and they will help to govern many of these assemblies, the provincial assemblies, and also come together to help control and command all the provincial armies as they rebelled against Spain. But this will start to continue to hold true, whereby there eventually will be a monarchy in the Netherlands, but they're going to share power with both the provincial assemblies and also sort of these local executives, the stadtholders, these government and others as well. So there are some similarities with both of these movements, albeit their histories are quite different. One of which is that there are independent religious movements that are being valued in both England and in the Netherlands. So a mixture of both Catholics and Protestants, whereby there is going to be conflict, but eventually, because there are a number of independent religious movements and the need to create a unified state, uh, they decided to be as tolerant as they can be, depending on the time in place. Okay? But we do have a number of religious movements that will grow out of this. For example, in England, there's a group known as the Puritan Church, which you've heard about at some point, who hope to purify the Church of England. And there are one particular group in there that decided, hey, you know what, that church could never be reformed, and they just decided to leave. A group known as the Pilgrims, who actually found their way from England to the Netherlands, and when they found out their kids were turning to become Dutch, they decided to move, and you could probably guess where, in our history, at least. And finally, another major similarity is that in both cases, again, this is in a lot of ways outside the realm of the political development of these regions, but the role of maritime trade grows in both regions. And thus, in both governments, you have strong key roles of merchants and other entrepreneurs that are influencing government and helping to eventually establish the various, both the Dutch and the British East India companies, both of which would be highly influential in global society. The British East India Company would be an example of this. There's a document that goes along with this, and I'll post this in the assignment, but this you may have seen it, and it could be optional, but we'll get to that at uh, the other like, government type that we want to look at is, and really the more common one is known as absolutism. Okay? And absolutism uh, grows in places like the provinces that would eventually make up Spain, France, in Central Europe, and others, because of the growing support from cities and towns. Again, maritime trade is coming in, there's added revenue, and do keep in mind that these cities and towns are separate from the old feudal estates, which are way out in the countryside. Okay? These are the ones that are connecting the various feudal estates, but again, they are separate, and in doing so, okay, their support of the monarchs is going to in the end help the monarchs to grow in power and as an exchange to help the growth of these particular cities. Not only that, but there's ideologies that are developing that in a lot of ways isn't necessarily a dramatic change from the past itself here. But again, the usage of Christianity to create justification for the establishment of these monarchies over feudal lords, okay? The creation of the what is known as the divine right of kings, that God himself has appointed the king as your secular ruler over over the entire society. Okay? And so that's the divine right, which will help to solidify the rule of the kings and also to ally itself with various churches as well. And what these new monarchs are able to do is to, one, limit the feudal warfare that's gone on between nobles and others for generation upon generation to formulate some of these states. Okay? And to increase the amount of centralized power over various regions. For the first time in many of these places, especially way out in the countrysides, peasants actually know who their kings are, and they hear about it from bureaucrats that are coming in collecting taxes and others, in addition to some of the old feudal regulations that they have had to live against. Okay? And also what many of these kings will do is they still have to contend against the nobility, because the nobility do not go away. They will continue to play a role, albeit a smaller and smaller and smaller role as we get to the 16th, 17th, and eventually the 18th century as well. So let's look at least one case study and one particular sample. So I want to spend some time examining particularly France. If we have some time, we'll get to the ones in Russia as well. Absolutism case studies. The first of which is in France, and nobody shows this more than King Louis XIV, often known as the Sun King. Okay? Not that he's bright or by any means here, but if you look at our particular solar system, right, everything revolves around the gravity of the sun. So that's the imagery that he wants you to get here, is that he is the center, bringing everything else into alignment. Hey, even things like, for example, his fashions, for instance. You look in the bottom corner here. So here he is. Here's, for example, King Louis eventually was losing hair. And so, of course, he decides he's going to put on some wigs, and that becomes part of the fashion of the day, okay, as well. Okay, he was very um, uh, knows about his height limitations, and so eventually will bring together things like heels and other fashion and dresses and so forth. But again, so it's not just simply fashion. He rules over a number of uh, other parts of the old feudal society, and one way he brings it together is the creation of a centralized bureaucracy. Okay. Through what are known as intendants. Okay, these are in other ways tax collectors or tax farmers that were told not to take too much. Okay, unlike previous tax formers of the past. Okay, and in doing so, in France, they create a number of local administrators of the crown known as the generalities, or the various regions in France as well. Okay. Not only that, but King Louis has created a modern army. Okay. Not in the way that they have just simply new and better weaponry, but they figure out the things that you absolutely need to create a powerful army. And much of that has to do with logistics. Can you feed? Can you transport people from one place to another? Okay. And a big weakness with feudal armies is that you never know what you're going to get when it comes to leadership. Okay. If status is based upon by birthright, you may actually have incompetent lords and nobles who are commanding these armies. And so one way that King Louis went around this was the establishment of positions like the lieutenant colonel. So you would sell this position, a key leadership position, a colonel in the army, for instance, to a lord or a noble that you need aid from, but you would ensure that he has a lieutenant who actually knows what he's doing. So someone from the army who actually is talented in regards to command as well. Okay. Furthermore, there were new weapons, things like, and here's a familiar term for you, the bayonet, okay, made from a French resin called bayon, that will add on sort of these right here, these pointed ends to muskets so that you can actually protect yourself against cavalry charges. So some technological advancements, logistical advancements, and also leadership advancements that will help as well. Okay. Furthermore, there are economic changes in terms of the standardization of measures and currency, which is going to start to sound like, hey, this is like the old Roman past here, whereby a larger government is able to centralize really essential things like standards and measures, okay, road systems, canal systems as well, and some subsidies for new industries. Okay. And what that's going to result in, especially with new bureaucrats, are the development of what is called mercantilism. And by mercantilism, okay, what you're trying to do with mercantilism is, hold on one second, let me come back here. What we want to do with mercantilism is to create new industries, domestic industries, give monopolies to certain key industries that you want to help to develop, and also to raise external tariffs and to create quotas for imports, that are coming into your country for specific goods, to ensure that as much resources remain in the state as possible. We'll come back to this term later on because this one's important. Okay, the new colonial system is going to also help development of external trade outside of France. And King Louis is going to try to demonstrate his power, through grand buildings like we're seeing elsewhere across the world at this time. And the one that he creates is the image that you see in the background here, and that would be the Palace of Versailles. Okay? And Versailles, in a lot of ways, becomes the symbol of wealth and status in French society. Okay? One way that he limited the power of the nobility is to invite the nobility to come live with them. We've all heard the phrase, keep your friends close, keep your, that's right, enemies closer, right? And so in order to ensure that the nobles aren't plotting against him or others, he would do two things. One, oftentimes, take their children in as wards, in other words, sort of as his adopted children, which sounds nice, but really what he's doing is that he's keeping them as hostage. In other words, don't do anything against me, otherwise, hey, I've got your kids. Or what King Louis does, he actually invites them as he creates this grand palace that you see in the background there. He actually invites them to live with him. And in doing so, many of the nobles are now focused not on their own power, but trying to get the ear of the king as best as they possibly can, because in the end, wherever you live, especially the people around you, they're going to influence your particular actions as well. King Louis becomes the patron of the arts and also creates this elaborate set of court rituals, banquets, concerts, operas, and balls that the nobility is a part of, that he's paying for through taxation and others, just to demonstrate his wealth, his symbol, and his power as well. There's Versailles, by the way. And I actually get to show off some of the tourist pictures that um, for when I went to the palace itself today. It is a museum, and you can go there. This here is the chapel. Many of the ceilings are all painted, and so this is just simply one example of this here. The king's bedroom, and of course, the king always wakes up to a bust of himself, right? Don't you? Okay. The gardens and the vast property of Versailles. Okay. And we have the famed, what is known as the Hall of Mirrors. This will become a place where treaties will be signed and others, really a great way to impress others who are coming into the state itself. Okay, so these are the grounds of Versailles. There's even a little village at the corner. One of the most famous queens of France, Marie Antoinette, who is from Austria, made a little village just to replicate some of the key childhood memories she had growing up in Austria. I'm going to go ahead and skip a few slides here and move past because I want to make sure that we uh, other parts of the presentation. So, and we can end it looking at some of the to this. All right, so let's go and take a look at the evaluation of these new developments and changes that are going on. Okay, in what becomes known as the Enlightenment. So we talk about global trade, and one of the trade goods that is being shipped all across, starting in the Middle East, but also across Asia and rest of the world, is the sale of caffeinated beverages like tea and coffee. And particularly with the growing middle class and nobles who are consuming these items here, many of them are gathered in salons, so basically discussion parlors, and coffee houses, and they're coming together and they're thinking about the world. We talked about the scientific revolution earlier, in that there are people who are saying, hey, we want to be able to look at this world scientifically, to look at this world reasonably. Okay, and so again, they're already looking at the physical world. So they're saying, hey, what about the rest of the world, the social order? Okay, and not only that, but this belief that humans themselves have the ability to change the world for good. Okay, and these philosophers, or the French word for it, the philosophes, are going to implement scientific method as a means to implement new thoughts. For example, Adam Smith, one of the key thinkers at this time, is going to have theories in regards to economics. What is the role of the state when it comes to economic exchange and functions and so forth here as well? This is going to be one of the documents that you will look at this particular time. So we'll come back to this one in just a bit. So we'll read about but the scientific method and reason is going to lead to new thoughts in economics. We just mentioned Smith and Cap, and what becomes known as the birth of capitalism, of feminism, the role of women in European society. And so we have authors like Mary Wollstonecraft and others, and particularly in regards to politics of Europe of this particular time. And so we have challengers such as Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a noble, Baron de Montesquieu, and the Englishman, John Locke, who are all going to create for themselves ideas that show the efficacy of human, that they can make a better society for themselves outside of the realm of absolutism. Okay? And so you're going to take a look at some of these thoughts, okay, and address some of the changes that are going on in Europe at this time. All right, guys.